Well, my name is Schroeder, and I work at the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm a research fellow there. And before then, I worked in Sweden at Chalmers University, and before that, I worked in London. And yeah, I've been working on virtual reality since the early 1990s and working on various other things. Oh, I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy and history, and I did a PhD at the London School of Economics in sociology. At the moment, I'm mainly working actually on something that's unrelated to presence, which is e-research or e-science, which means how scientists collaborate at a distance. So how they work together and the various social issues to do with that. But I'm still working on virtual environments. My main work is in multi-user virtual environments, social virtual environments, and how people interact with each other in those. Okay. My definition is a virtual environment is something where you have the experience of being in another place or space and being able to interact with it. So I would say that presence or being there is that phenomenon of being in another, having the sensation of being in another place or space, being able to interact with it. That means that co-presence or being there together is being in that other place and being able to interact with the other person. And I have a rather strict definition because I think that experience of being there must be a sensory one. So it must involve one of the five senses, primarily, of course, vision and auditory interaction. But that's just my definition. Well, I think it's over the years it's gone into different directions. I mean, I do think that there is a need for focus, maybe in technology development, maybe in study. But my particular area has been multi-user environments, social environments, and I think there's very little work so far. So it's not even possible maybe to say what the focus is at the moment. The multi-user environments and the systems that you use to have a sense of being in another place, those are technology. The study of how we experience that and how we interact within the environments, that I would say is mostly a science. In my particular area, social science. Well, I think it's not possible really to say for presence as such. I think you have to look at the technology on one side and the technology developers. And then there's another side, which is how we understand how people interact. And that, I think, is, in terms of science, encompasses a broad range of disciplines such as psychology, sociology, and various others even. I was doing something completely different in 1991. And then I read a book by Howard Rheingold, which came out roughly in 1991, which was the first kind of journalistic account of virtual reality. And at that stage, virtual reality was like a big new thing. There was a lot of hype about it. And I was living in London at the time. I went to a talk that he gave at a bookshop, and he was signing his books and explaining a little bit about the book. And I asked him, I went up to him afterwards. He's a very colorful figure. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, is anyone studying this yet from a kind of social perspective? And he said, no, not as far as I know, because there was nobody at the time. And I said, right, this is interesting, I'll do that. I think what keeps me interested in, I mean, the first few years I studied virtual reality, it was still mainly single-user systems. And they were being used in various different places, and I wrote about that, and I wrote about that until about the mid-90s. I was writing about mainly the social implications. So it was kind of a study of the implications of the new technology. But since then, I've moved more and more into multi-user systems. And that is an area where there are not so many people studying it, really. And it's absolutely fascinating because the number of issues that you can study in this area, such as how do avatars interact? How do they behave in relation to one another? Do they behave differently from how we're relating here face to face? How do they interact in small groups, in large groups, and so on? This is something that you can study endlessly, and not so many people are studying it. The other thing that we're always emphasizing is, I think, one of the main problems in this area has been that we have had these systems from a technological point of view for a long time. And video conferencing, for example, which is a kind of related technology, that's been around since the 1960s. And yet, even nowadays, not so many people use video conferencing at all. So why is this? And I think one of the interesting things that we showed in about the year 2000, 2001, is we showed that if you have two cave-type systems, and I was working in Sweden at the time, and another group of Mel Slater and his colleagues was working in London, we showed that if you connect these two cave systems, and you have one person in one country and one person in another, and they are trying to do a Rubik's Cube puzzle together. Okay, so they're in different countries, so it's like a video conferencing system, but they are manipulating a Rubik's Cube, and one is handing the cubes to another. We showed that you can do that just as well with two cave systems as you can do it just on a table, passing the cubes, physical cubes, to each other. And I think that's a very important finding because that essentially means that it's not always as good to do things face-to-face as it is maybe in some kinds of virtual reality systems. And I think we're still trying to figure out what can you do in virtual environments or in video conferencing systems. What can you do that you can do just as well as face-to-face? Now, the implications of that are very, very important over the long term. I mean, imagine if we don't have to fly to different places anymore, if we don't have to work together in the same place. This is a very important question, and it's very curious that it hasn't been focused on and studied more. Well, one of the interesting things here is that, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about is video conferencing and distributed work. Now, another area is large-scale social spaces online, where you have many, many people online together. And at the moment, for example, the most popular one is Second Life. Many people have heard of this, and apparently it has hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of simultaneous users. Well, not simultaneously, maybe a few thousand simultaneous users. But certainly many, many users. And if you think that that is a virtual environment, then that is the most widely used. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Second Life has got a lot of attention recently in the press, in the media, and so on. But actually, these systems have been there since the mid-1990s. And we have studied a number of them, and there have been many different types of systems. So the question is, why did this only recently take off with Second Life? And you might have some answers about that. More people have broadband internet. More people have been getting interested into these systems. The graphics cards, the sound perhaps has gotten better in some of these systems. So they're becoming more popular. But again, we have a very limited understanding of why people use these things, how they use them. Again, how do avatars interact? What kind of possibilities do they have? A very simple question that is almost nothing written about it yet, one or two things maybe, is what is the difference between how people interact with each other, depending in a system like Second Life, depending whether they have text or voice. Very important for interpersonal relationships, but we still know a very small amount of things about that. So there's lots of possibilities for research, I would say. Well, I think I would quite like to see a very nice, fully functioning video conferencing or virtual environment system for being able to work together. That would be very nice, but it's very difficult to do. I'd also like to see online social spaces. We just talked about Second Life. There are also many massively multiplayer games. I think in those types of environments, you have a lot of very nice possibilities for experimenting with how people can interact with each other. What can they really do with each other, apart from playing games with each other, apart from chasing after monsters or collecting points, put it crudely. I mean, I think there are very nice examples of where people have worked together. Again, one of the nice things that you can do in these large on-scale online virtual spaces is you can build together. You can build houses, you can build cities, you can experiment with different ways of forming societies, creating rules by which you can live and so on. All that is very exciting and has a lot of different potential. Well, I think this is a very large topic, so we could sit here for a few hours, but in the interest of not doing that, I think there are a lot of issues, again, for single-user systems, and I'm not so interested myself in those. I think the issues become much more complicated and much more interesting when you have multi-user systems. And in multi-user systems, you have a range of questions that really revolve around how people interact with each other and how they see each other. For example, if I'm participating in a multi-user environment and I have a particular avatar, I have a particular appearance, then I might have, for example, created that appearance. I might have put on certain types of clothes. I might have made myself appear in a particular way. Do I have ownership of that representation? Do I own it, or do the people who have designed and own the system have control over it? That is becoming a very real question for some people. Or, for example, imagine that I've been spending a lot of time in a multi-user virtual environment, and I have built up some property, and I have a certain appearance and so on. And I have been investing a lot of time in that particular system. All of a sudden, the people who have designed the system decide to shut it down, or perhaps they have designed another system which follows on from it, which might appear different and so on. Can I take my personal appearance with me? Should I have the right to do that? Do I take my property with me? I think these sound like very abstract questions, but you can, I think you can relate them to a whole set of technologies that have been developed nowadays. For example, Facebook, MySpace, social networking sites. If I have created a certain profile, a certain appearance, a certain set of relationships with people in those kinds of technologies, what ownership, what rights do I have if the system changes? Or how should I present myself over the various mediated system in which I am represented? Should I have a consistent identity? Should people be able to use what I portray myself with and modify it? Or don't I have control over it? All these are kind of questions that I think are becoming more and more important as we spend more and more time presenting ourselves to others online in a particular way. As we have an online persona, an online presence if you like, and we interact with each other mainly through that online presence. So obviously you will get an impression of me and how I present myself. I will get an impression of you, and both these things are changing over the course of time. And then the question is, what is our relationship with each other in the light of how we present ourselves? Well, I think again, I think it's interesting because from a technological point of view, we can do most of the things that we want to do. We can have very realistic virtual environments. We can present ourselves and the environment around us in a very realistic way, both in a computer-generated virtual environment or indeed in a video conferencing environment with 3D technologies. I think the main bottlenecks are actually not the technological ones, but the social ones, about how we use them. How can we most effectively use these systems? What kind of virtual environments are really suitable for different purposes under different circumstances? When is it best to use just a desktop system as opposed to an immersive system? What are the conditions for using each of those different types of systems under different circumstances? It's not the technology, it's how we use it that poses the most important questions to my mind. I think I've been able to do many of the things that I've wanted to do because of the, in my previous job, we had a cave at our place of work so we could study immersive technology. We had head-mounted displays and so on. I think the main problem is actually that you don't have enough resources, people, to study experiments or observation work, that you don't have the people power to do the experiments rather than the technology. And in terms of what I'd like to do, there are a million different studies that I would like to do, especially in multi-user worlds. There's surprisingly few people who study this. It's quite interesting. Well, I think in terms of experiments, you can do lots of different experiments. The experiments that I would like to do particularly are where you vary the size of the group. So that in this room at the moment, there are 5 people. How would we be interacting in a virtual environment space? Normally, you have either a single person or 2 persons working together. But I think what I would like to see is, as you increase the number of persons, how does that influence the way we can really effectively interact? Because my sense is that you can't really interact with too many people online. Offline, we 5 people here in this room could interact very easily. It's much more difficult to do in virtual environments, whether they are in a cave or in a desktop system. And that has not really been studied so far. Well, I don't think it's going to change our whole conception of reality. What I think is happening is that more and more of us are spending more and more of our everyday lives in mediated communication. More and more of our time goes to spending time on the mobile phone, looking at the screen, perhaps spending time in an online space together with other people during the afternoon and so on. So I think the interesting thing there is that we tend to see virtual reality as being this new thing that gives us a new view of reality. But actually, I think we are being mediated more and more throughout the course of the day. And I think we need to understand that these are all forms in which we communicate with one another, and they are quite different, but there are also some similarities between them. So, for example, I would suggest that even using things like mobile phones and even things like writing emails or getting information from the web, even these things can be compared in some way to using virtual environments. So I think we need to understand much better how all these different mediated environments work and not worry so much about these larger questions about reality. Again, I would say not so much how I see myself, but I certainly think that I've been doing a lot more thinking about how we spend our days in online spaces. And I think it's interesting if, for example, I watch my kids. They're 13 and 15 now. And of course, they have a very different understanding of the online world from what I do. But I can watch them and I can see how they spend time and they are fascinated in a different way, but they're also not so curious about other parts of virtual environments that I'm curious about. So I think that's quite interesting. How do people interact with each other in multi-user virtual environments? That's the question I'm trying to answer.